Imagine a quiet night in late summer. It is September 18th, 1931. The air is cool outside the city of Mukden, a vital hub in the vast, resource-rich plains of Manchuria. At precisely 10:20 p.m., a dull thud echoes through the dark. A small plume of smoke rises from a section of the South Manchuria Railway near a place called Liutiao Lake. Minutes later, a train approaches. The engineer doesn't see a crater. He doesn't see twisted metal. He doesn't even feel a bump. The train rattles over the tracks, perfectly intact, and continues its journey into the night. That tiny failed explosion. A blast so weak it couldn't even derail a single car, is perhaps the most successful lie in the history of modern warfare. It was a bomb that didn't work by physical standards, but by political standards, it was the most powerful weapon in the Japanese arsenal. Within hours, it would trigger an invasion. Within months, it would create a puppet state. And within a decade, it would lead to the deaths of millions across the Pacific. This is the story of the Mukden Incident, how a rogue group of officers faked a war, defied their own government, and set the world on an irreversible path toward global catastrophe. To understand why a few inches of railroad track mattered so much, we have to look at the map of 1930s Asia. Manchuria was a massive territory in northeast China, roughly the size of France and Germany combined. It was a land of contradictions, technically part of the Republic of China, but practically a lawless frontier ruled by powerful warlords and coveted by foreign empires. For the Empire of Japan, Manchuria wasn't just land, it was a lifeline. Japan is a resource-poor island nation. By the 1920s, it was facing an existential crisis. Its population was booming, but its soil couldn't grow enough food. Its industry was expanding, but it lacked iron, coal, and oil. The Great Depression of 1929 hit Japan like a hammer, collapsing its silk exports and leaving millions of farmers in poverty. To the Japanese military and the nationalist hawks in Tokyo, Manchuria was the Lebensraum of the East. It had the minerals, the timber, and the space they desperately needed. But there was a problem. Japan already had a foothold there through the South Manchuria Railway, which they had won from Russia in 1905. Guarding this railway was an elite, increasingly radicalized unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, known as the Kwantung Army. These men were not just soldiers, they were ideologues. They believed that Japan's destiny was to rule Asia, and they viewed their own civilian government in Tokyo, who favored diplomacy and international law, as weak, corrupt, and westernized. They saw the League of Nations as a tool for Western powers to keep Japan in check. The tension was a ticking clock. On one side, you had the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, who were finally trying to unify China and reclaim Manchuria from the regional warlord Zhang Shuiliang. On the other, you had the Kwantung Army, who knew that if they didn't act soon, China would become too strong to conquer. Every great lie needs an architect. For the Mukden Incident, there were two, Colonel Seishiro Itagaki and Lieutenant Colonel Kanji Ishiwara. Ishiwara was a brilliant but fanatical strategist. He had developed a theory called the Final War, a belief that a cataclysmic conflict between the East, led by Japan, and the West, led by the United States, was inevitable. To win this war, he argued, Japan had to seize Manchuria's resources immediately. He didn't just want a colony, he wanted a fortress. These men didn't want to wait for permission from the emperor or the prime minister. In fact, they knew the civilian government would say no, so they decided to create a fait accompli, an accomplished fact that couldn't be undone. They would start a war and then dare the government to stop them. The plan was as simple as it was cynical. On the night of September 18th, members of the Kwantung Army's independent garrison unit, led by Lieutenant Suemori Kawamoto, crept toward the tracks at Liutiao Lake. They carried a small amount of yellow gunpowder, deliberately measured to be weak. Why weak? Because they needed the South Manchuria Railway to remain functional for their own troop movements. They didn't want to destroy the track, they wanted to destroy the peace. At 10:20 p.m., the charge was detonated. The blast was so minor that a train passing by only minutes later didn't even slow down. But for the Kwantung Army, the attack had begun. Immediately, the Japanese claimed that Chinese soldiers from the nearby North Barracks, Beidaying, had attacked the railway. They didn't wait for an investigation. They didn't call for a diplomatic summit. Within hours, Japanese heavy artillery, 2 massive 24-centimeter Type 7 howitzers that had been secretly smuggled into Mukden, disassembled in crates, labeled as industrial machinery, began shelling the Chinese barracks. The Chinese soldiers, following strict orders from young Marshal Zhang Sueliang, who was then bedridden in a Peking hospital, were told to avoid provoking the Japanese at all costs. Caught in a nightmare, many were shot while sleeping or trying to flee without their weapons as the non-resistance policy took its toll. By the next morning, the city of Mukden, a city of hundreds of thousands, was under the boot of the Kwantung Army. What makes this the most successful lie isn't that people believed it. In fact, almost no one in the international community believed the Japanese account. Journalists quickly noted the impossibility of a train passing over destroyed tracks. The lie was successful because of how it paralyzed the Japanese government in Tokyo. When Prime Minister Wakatsuki Reijiro heard the news, he was horrified. He ordered the army to stop immediately. But the Kwantung Army simply ignored him. They moved reinforcements from Korea into Manchuria, claiming self-defense. In Tokyo, the military leadership began to side with the heroes on the front lines. The civilian government realized that if they tried to arrest the officers, the army might revolt at home. The public, fueled by nationalist propaganda and news of glorious victories, was already in the streets celebrating. The tail was now wagging the dog. The Kwantung Army had effectively staged a coup, not by taking over the palace in Tokyo, but by conquering a province in China and forcing the government to accept it. As Japan consolidated its grip, the world looked to the League of Nations. This was the moment the new world order established after World War I was supposed to work. China appealed for help. The League responded by forming a commission led by the British Lord Lytton. But here is the slow burn tragedy. The commission took 6 months to even arrive in Asia. By the time they were walking the tracks at Liutiao Lake, the Japanese had already finished their conquest. The Japanese assisted the commission by providing staged witnesses and curated tours. Lord Lytton and his team were followed by Japanese spies every step of the way. The Lytton report, when it finally arrived, was a masterpiece of diplomatic stalling. It admitted the truth, that the explosion was not a valid reason for war, and that the new state Japan had created was a sham. But it also tried to appease Japan, suggesting they had legitimate interests in the region. It was too little, too late. When the League finally voted to condemn Japan in 1933, the vote was tallied 42-1 against Japan.
The chairman announces the result of the ballot. 42 nations out of the 44 present condemned Japan's Manchurian policy.
The Japanese representative, Yosuke Matsuoka, didn't argue. He simply stood up, gave a defiant speech about Japan being misunderstood. Then he simply gathered his papers and walked out of the hall, followed by his entire staff in stone-faced silence.
This was the moment the post-World War I peace officially died.
By walking out, Japan proved that international law was only an option, not a rule. Japan had called the world's bluff. They proved that the League had no teeth, no army, and no real power. Watching from Europe, a certain politician in Germany and a dictator in Italy were paying very close attention. The Mukden Incident didn't just break Manchuria, it broke the spine of international law. The stage was set. The lie had become a reality. But the Kwantung army wasn't finished. They had a new plan, a puppet state, a last emperor, and a path that would lead straight to Pearl Harbor. With Mukden secured, the Kwantung army faced a branding problem. They'd stolen a massive territory, but the world called them thieves. To change the narrative, they needed a legitimate leader. Enter Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. Since his abdication as a child, he had been living in the Japanese concession in Tianjin, a man obsessed with his lost glory. The Japanese Secret Service, led by the Mata Hari of the East, Yoshiko Kawashima, began a psychological operation to rescue him. They sent him death threats. They placed a bomb in a basket of fruit delivered to his home. Then, the Japanese offered him protection. On a dark night in November 1931, they smuggled Puyi out of Tianjin in the trunk of a car, wrapped in a Japanese military greatcoat. He believed he was going home to reclaim his throne. In reality, he was being delivered to a prison with a crown. On March 1st, 1932, the Japanese unveiled their masterpiece, Manchukuo. This was a new type of state. It wasn't a colony on paper, it was a multi-ethnic paradise. But the structure was a cold-blooded hierarchy. The Japanese created a Concordia Association to replace political parties. Every government office had a Japanese advisor who held the real seal of power. This was the birth of a military-industrial state. They turned Manchuria into a laboratory for total war. They built massive steelworks at Anshan and hydroelectric dams on the Yalu River. But this progress was built on the backs of millions of Chinese laborers who were essentially corvée slaves. The slow burn here is the realization that Japan wasn't just taking land, they were building a continental engine to power a much larger war. The bomb at Liutiao Lake was so small it couldn't destroy a rail. Yet, that tiny spark ignited a fire that burned down 50 cities and claimed 20 million lives in China alone. We often think history is made by great men and great ideas. But the Mukden Incident shows us that history is often made by middle-ranking men and small lies. It shows how easily a professional military can hijack a democracy and how quickly the world can descend into chaos when no one has the courage to call a lie until the guns start firing.